بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لقد جاءكم رسول من أنفسكم عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Inshallah, in this concluding talk that we have tonight, we will discuss some of the aspects of the legacy and the diplomacy of the Prophet in order to bring to a close our discussion. But of course, bringing to a close this series of discussions does not mean that the topic has been exhausted or that we can say that we have been able to fully understand how it is that the Prophet's practice and his legacy was dynamic and was to be implemented in our time. That is a lifelong struggle for us, and in fact, even more than a lifelong struggle, it is a generational struggle for the Muslim community. Yesterday I raised one question, and we discussed some of the dimensions of that question. I want to broaden the scope of that question in order to answer some common objections and questions that come about Shia ahadith and the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam. And then inshallah we will move on from that topic. The question, or one of the questions which we briefly discussed yesterday was, why is it the case that in some cases we have two different rulings which have been narrated about the same issue from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salatu wassalam? Now that by itself is not something which is a very, very big deal. There are conflicting opinions, not just among different schools of thought within Sunni Islam, but even from the same scholar. So if you look at the opinions attributed to Abu Hanifa, for example, sometimes there is more than one opinion about the same issue attributed to Abu Hanifa himself. Of course, there are differences between Abu Hanifa and maybe another faqih, but even one person, there are different opinions attributed. Ash-Shafi'i, for example, Muhammad ibn Idris Ash-Shafi'i, the founder of one of the major schools of thought within Sunni Islam, the major schools of law, he has many opinions which shifted in his later and more mature career. He had a portion of his career in Medina and he had a portion of his career in Egypt. And so you will often hear his opinions quoted as قال الشافعي في القديم and قال الشافعي في الجديد. So Shafi'i said in his old opinion and in his new opinion. There was a change, a growth, a development. It's not so easy for us to attribute a similar kind of logic to the Imams though, because we do not believe that the Imams had a growth or a development. That Imam Baqir alayhi salam, for example, sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, he had that famous trip to Sham in the time of Hisham, and so his opinion before he went and he saw Damascus was different from his opinion afterwards. That is not how the Imams' knowledge was learned or was transmitted by them. We don't believe that Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, for example, discovered a new source, changed his opinions, learned or grew in his knowledge after he went to Kufa and then returned to Medina. So this difference of opinion that we find within the Imams, it can't be similar to, for example, the change that took place with Shafi'i's opinion. One reason, of course, might be that sometimes there might be an inaccuracy in the narration. That is always possible. Abu Hanifa only had one opinion, but some people misunderstood. They heard the opinion of one of his students, they thought it was the opinion of Abu Hanifa. That type of mistake might take place about the Imams as well. Somebody was present, but the Imam gave a detailed answer and they only took one piece of it and they misunderstood it. Right? The Quran says, "La taqrabu salata wa antum sukara." Don't come near prayer when you are intoxicated. If a person just hears "La taqrabu salat," they would think the Quran is saying don't pray. But of course that is not the meaning of the verse. So these types of mistakes, humorous or actual, they can take place. But the question that we also have with regard to the Imams is that in some cases there may be a sahih looking hadith with an authentic chain of transmission, well-known and recognized scholars who have narrated one thing from the Imams. And then there might be one or a number of traditions which come from a less well-recognized source. And we then have the question that if we are talking about a mistake, of course it is more likely that the mistake is from the less well-known series of transmissions. Right? If you read two reports about a speech given by the President of the United States, one comes from the New York Times and one comes from some small newspaper in Iowa, and they have a difference about certain details, you're probably going to assume that the New York Times had better resources, more qualified reporters, better means of conveying the message, and it is more accurate. And so the tendency that some people have is to think that you only need to look at the sanad. The better, more famous, more recognized sanad, that is going to be more accurate. That is like the New York Times. And the other sanad, which might be less well known, that is going to be like the small town newspaper that might make a mistake. Right? One example, which we mentioned yesterday, is the fact that we do have some ahadith which seem to have a good sanad that say that to fast on the day of Ashura is a kaffara and an atonement for one's sins in the past year. We also have many ahadith that do say that a person should not fast on the day of Ashura because it was the practice of Banu Umayyah. Purely in terms of the sanad, one might argue that the ahadith which favor fasting on Ashura, they have a better sanad. My point that I want to introduce this question in order to convey is that from the Shi'i perspective, the sanad is important, but it is not the entire story. This focus on the sanad and is the hadith sahih, or is the sanad or the isnad of the hadith, the chain of transmission, is it weak? That is much more a matter of emphasis within non-Shi'i schools of thought. And even there, it is not universal among Ahlul Sunnah. The Hanafi school of thought, for example, historically did not give a great deal of importance to the sanad either. What they said is that if a person wants to make up a hadith, they will make up a sanad as well. And the more motivation they have to make up a hadith, the more motivation they have to do a great deal of research and make a sanad that looks really credible. And they'll make two, so that they support one another. And so Hanafis, it's not just the Shia, the Hanafis also said that you can't just take the chain of transmission and say that's the end of story, because it's a very good chain, that therefore the content is something which is going to be recognized. Historically, the Hanafis did not rely on books like Sahih al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim without question. They would say that you have to look at the hadith, look at the chain, but also look at the context and look at the content and see as a whole whether this is credible or not. Over time, though, one can say that within the Sunni school of thought, it became sort of a shorthand for scholarship to focus on the chain of transmission. And some people assume then that this also applies to the Shia school of thought. And then questions come up. That I found this hadith, it seems to be sahih, but this is not the fatwa that Shia ulama give. This is not the practice that the Shia have. And so that is the issue that I want to address. Please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Just to make sure that all of you are still with me with respect to what we are talking about. There are certain times when we have a narration from Ahlul Bayt, we have a hadith attributed to the Prophet or to one of the Imams, and it has a good chain of transmission, but because of other evidence or for other reasons, it might not be what is followed by the jurists and the scholars of the school of Ahlul Bayt in issuing their fatwas. And that raises a question that then what is the basis that they are using if it is not the chain of transmission? So the first point that I wanted to make is that this idea that the chain is the strongest or the best evidence by itself is not something which is going to necessarily be true. It is an important factor and it cannot be ignored. And this is where the Shia are different from the Hanafis. We do give importance to the chain of transmission, but we recognize that there are certain systematic weaknesses when you look at the chain of transmission. If I want to compare it back to my newspaper example, the systematic example or weaknesses are this. The New York Times generally will have more resources, better fact checkers, and better editors than a small-time or small-town newspaper. So in general, if you want to see what is going to be the best reliable source for news, as a whole, you're on pretty solid ground if you go with the New York Times. But because the New York Times is a large entity, when there are major failures that reflect not just one individual fact checker, but questions about broader societal assumptions or government policy, the New York Times is likely to be subject to more political pressure from its corporate owners or from the political system than a small-town newspaper is going to be subjected to. Is the example clear? Generally, you are better off with that better sanad, to compare it to hadith. But when you look at that better sanad, you also have to recognize that the fact that it is a better sanad means that there are going to be certain systemic weaknesses that will result from its prominence and from its credibility. And unless you factor in those weaknesses, then you might be good on many details, but you will make very large mistakes, like believing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, for example, which have not been followed. Those who relied on alternative media sources, those who didn't have that credibility, and that major story, they ended up being better off or worse off. Far better off. Right? So this is something which we need to factor in. And Shia scholarship basically recognizes this point, that the sanad is one important factor, but when you have a large sanad, then there are certain types of weaknesses which will crop in to that heritage. And so you also have to look at the historical factors that surrounded the lives of the Imams. Now, the next question that comes in is, what were those historical factors? Why would the Imams issue a ruling or say a statement which might not correspond to the actual ruling which they wanted to convey as the correct practice or belief of Islam? There are some people, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. There are some cases where we have a hadith from the Imams, we have a number of different teachings from the Imams about legal rulings, about other aspects of our practice as Muslims. And for some Muslims, they say that the job of a prophet or the job of an Imam, first and foremost, is to convey these legal rulings that have been revealed by Allah. So there can be no diplomacy, or there can be no taqiyya, or there can be no concealment of a legal ruling. The question is like this, that if prayer is wajib, then the job of a prophet, or an imam, if you believe the imam is a successor of the prophet, or a faqih, or an alim, or a scholar, if you believe that the scholars are the ones who are in charge of conveying Islam, their primary job is to convey this ruling that salat is wajib. If their life is threatened, they still have to convey it. And they have to give the sacrifice of their life, because that is their primary duty. So why would it be the case that an imam might say that, well, to preserve the imam's life, or to preserve the life of a narrator, or to preserve some other interest, the imam might perhaps use a diplomatic answer and not convey the straightforward answer? The next question that comes in is, do the imams have a justifiable reason for not always giving a straightforward answer? The questioner would say that, well, if a particular thing is wajib, for example, the imam should say it, come what might. Because at least the principle will be clear. It'll be recorded properly in a book of hadith, it'll be recorded properly in a book of fiqh, and maybe the imam will have to suffer for it. Maybe the narrator will have to suffer for it. Maybe even some people will have to give their lives for it. But at least it will be preserved properly. But when the imam gives a diplomatic answer and then corrects it later, some people might not get that correction. And so they would be misled, and that cannot be done. So that is the question, that yes, we believe in general that there are differences between prominent newspapers and small-town newspapers. We understand these kinds of pressures. We understand that you need to look at the history, but it is not possible for the imams to give an answer which is not going to be the actual ruling of God, because the ruling of God is so important. The quickest answer that we can give to that, to understand the reality of this question, without getting into a very detailed answer, is to say that if simply conveying a straightforward message were enough to ensure that the message were preserved, then take a look at the literature of hadith, which exists within the broader Muslim world. Can you find the teachings of Imam Muhammad Baqir and Imam Ja'far Sadiq and Imam Musa Kadhim alayhimus salam, who are known among all Muslims as being peerless scholars and having, in the view of the Shia, the authentic version of Islam, but even in the view of those who are not Shia, their own school of thought? So has it survived or has it not survived? And if it has not survived in the general body of a hadith, except for a very small number of a hadith, maybe 5 or 10 ahadith attributed to each and every one of the imams, that shows that even if a person conveys a message in a straightforward manner, that doesn't mean that it's going to be preserved over the long term. For it to be preserved over the long term means that there needs to be institutions. It generally means that there needs to be a community of people who are going to be able to learn those books and those ahadith and then pass them on. There needs to be certain physical institutions. There needs to be certain financial resources All of those need to exist in order for the heritage to be passed on. In the view of those who are not Shia, the Imams gave their straightforward teachings. What they said on the surface is exactly what they believed, and there is no diplomacy involved, and there is no need to dig further, because they would only convey straightforwardly whatever Allah said. If that were sufficient for it to be preserved, then why did they not preserve the comprehensive teachings of the Imams? If we only find a few dozens of ahadith attributed to those Imams whom even non-Shia believe were among the most knowledgeable and prominent people among their time, that shows that that is not enough. And so, the reason why the Imams may have to use a dual track or sometimes several different messages at once is because they needed to preserve not just the superficial teaching of Islam, but also the ability of the community of their followers to exist. And not just the physical lives of their followers, but their ability to gather, their ability to be recognized without being attacked, without having their lives compromised, their ability to function and to form a community and to have masajid and have circles where they will pass on ahadith, and to be able to have their material and financial resources preserved. And so in some cases, the Imams needed to pronounce their teachings in such a way where the followers of the Imams would be able to preserve the institution, even if it means the specific ruling the Imam is giving might not be the ruling which is the authentic ruling of Islam. Because once the institution is preserved, and the community of followers of Imam is preserved, then there will be the heritage that will be discussed, the context will be visible, and it will allow them to be able to maintain their intellectual tradition and preserve the authentic teachings of the Imams. The institution sometimes is more important than the individual teaching. A good example of that is Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salatu wassalam. He once told one of his prominent companions that do wudu as the non-Shia do wudu. Wash your face 3 times, wash your forearms 3 times, and do the wudu in the way that, until the end, that the non-Shia do. Now this person was a scholar, he was a student of our 7th Imam, he knew that this is not how the wudu of the Imams had been taught, it is not how the wudu of the Prophet was, but he submitted and he did the wudu in that way. What had happened is that the Caliph had realized that this person had a connection to the Imams. And so Harun was the Caliph at the time, and he himself had observed secretly how his associate, who was also a companion of Imam Musa Kadhim, was going to do wudu. And when he saw him preparing for prayer, and he didn't know that Harun was watching him, the Caliph was watching him and spying on him to see, does he do wudu like us, or does he do wudu like the Shia do wudu? When he saw his wudu like the Caliph and his school of thought did wudu, he then came out of his hiding. He said that I had believed the rumor, but now I found out that the rumor is not accurate, and you must be one of us. And then later on, the Imam sent a letter to that companion, Ali ibn Yaqtin, that you can go back to doing wudu the right way. So in these types of examples, the hadith on the surface might be a sahih hadith, because it was actually conveyed by the Imam, either for a very limited time, or depending on the need for a more extended time, in order to give that respite to a person. It preserved his position, it preserved his life, and it preserved his ability to later on convey the depth of the teachings of the Imams. So these types of things, they exist within our heritage, and it's not something which is unique to the heritage of the Shia. And this is where I wanted to bring the discussion. When I say that we need to have a more complete understanding and a more deep understanding of our traditions, if you see a hadith that seems to be sahih, and somebody tells you it's a sahih hadith, so why does so-and-so have a different fatwa? Why do the Shia practice something differently? Don't get afraid all of a sudden and say, well, something must be wrong. But this is not exclusive to the Shia as well. I'll just mention one example. There is a hadith that is found in the Sahih. The one version of it is found in Sahih Muslim, narrated from Aisha, who is the wife of the Prophet. She says that the Prophet said that if it had not been that these people of Quraysh and the Arabs just recently used to be mushrik, then I would have made some changes. The changes are, and I'm not authenticating the hadith, I'm saying that it is found in an authentic source according to many Muslims, and it is reported as follows. The Prophet said that all of these things which are the relics of the Kaaba, the ancient artifacts that were found within the Kaaba, some of which are said to have gone back to very ancient times and even to the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, I would have sold these and used that money or the proceeds for our Islamic causes. But I didn't do so because these people just were mushrik and they give some kind of importance to these relics. I would have lowered the doors of the Kaaba to the ground. Some of you may have seen a picture of the Kaaba and you might have noticed that the doors of the Kaaba are not at ground level. They are raised up. That is at the time of the Prophet as well, and this hadith claims that the Prophet said, I would have lowered the doors down to the ground level, because that is where they should have originally been, from the way that Ibrahim alayhi salam had built the Kaaba. And then he says that, according to this hadith, I would have included Hijr Ismail within the Kaaba. If you look at the Kaaba now, there is a building, the Kaaba, which is roughly a cubicle building, approximately. And there is a semicircle with a fence that is known as Hijr Ismail. But it is not connected to the Kaaba. There is a little bit of a gap between the wall of the Kaaba and the wall of Hijr Ismail. The hadith says that the Prophet would have connected the two. And he said that this was the proper dimensions of the Kaaba, and it should have been within the Kaaba, but the Quraysh built it wrong. Now, and when you go for tawaf, all Muslims, they do include the Hijr within their tawaf. They don't do tawaf between the Kaaba and Hijr Ismail, they include it within their tawaf of the Kaaba. But the Prophet did not change the building of the Kaaba, and he didn't lower the doors, and he didn't get rid of those artifacts. And why did he say he didn't do it? Because it wasn't right? Because it wasn't the way that Allah intended the Kaaba to be? Because it wasn't the way that Ibrahim built it? No. It was what he would have done. He said, the only thing preventing me is that these people just used to be mushrik until yesterday. And if I begin making these changes, then they will begin to doubt the authenticity of my message, or they will begin to doubt whether things in Islam are revealed from Allah or whether it is the personal preference of the Prophet, or maybe other types of doubts will enter into their mind. And so the Prophet left things as they are. So this is the kind of diplomacy that we are talking about. That there is a greater interest in the view of the Prophet. But the greater interest is such that the Prophet is saying that things should be changed. However, I cannot do so and I will not do so because there is a greater interest. If putting the door down to the ground level and expanding the Kaaba to include Hijr Ismail and getting rid of those relics for some temporary short-term gain to an Islamic cause will cause people to doubt Islam itself, if it will make many of the Arab tribes that have recently accepted Islam murtad and leave Islam altogether, then it's not worth the sacrifice. The price is greater than the importance of correcting those mistakes that crept up in the Jahiliyyah when the Quraysh were in charge of the Kaaba. So it's not just a matter of the Shia tradition believing in this principle. This is something which we find within the authentic sources of Islam. The Prophet himself, who is a prophet of Allah, is saying that there are some interests which are greater than making sure that a person does wudu right at one time. The example in the time of the Prophet is not wudu, but it is a similar principle that is in operation. So the general principle that we have from the Prophet, and which was applied equally by the Imams, is that the interest of the Muslim community is not just in having the Imam express a hadith for one moment, but then not ensure that the hadith can be preserved. Just say the right thing, even if it means the Rawi is going to get killed or going to get imprisoned and his books are going to get burned and his community is going to be scattered and it will never get preserved. No, the Imams, their effort was to preserve things for the long term. And that is why there is a need for strong institutions with investments of energy and time and capital and specialization in order to be able to properly understand the heritage of the Imams. People often say that, well, if our fiqh and our Islamic knowledge is based on hadith, then Imam Ja'far Sadiq should have just sat down and written one tafsir and published it, and written a Tawdih al-Masail or Risala Amaliya and published it. And he could have written a book on belief and a book on Irfan and just published those, and that would have been our concise Oxford Encyclopedia of Shi'ism, and we wouldn't have to have all the scholarship. No, that wouldn't work. Because if the Imam had written a concise Oxford edition of Shia Islam from the lips of Imam Ja'far Sadiq, it would have been destroyed, just as the broader Muslim community did try to destroy the lives of the Imams and the heritage of the Imams. And so this organic manner of preserving the teachings is what ensured that the teachings of the Imams survived. The fact that we need scholarship now in order to access it should not blind us to the reality that these were the means by which those teachings have been preserved. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And now this was one important issue that I wanted to just discuss in order for us to understand how to access the heritage and the teachings of the Prophet. But I wanted to also give a few examples in a more practical and a more day-to-day manner of the fact that the Prophet would think for long-term interests and not for short-term interests. And to the extent that we have time, I will just give a few examples so that we see that this principle of looking at long-term interests and not just for short-term interests, it's not something which is academic and theoretical and only for answering objections, but it is a comprehensive principle the Prophet had. The first example I want to give is from the time of the emigration from Mecca to Medina. There is an event that took place which you are familiar with as the Mu'akhat. The Prophet brought a brotherhood between the Muhajirin and the Ansar. He paired one of the people who had migrated from Mecca and had given up their property and their livelihood, and in some cases even split up their family, with one member of the Ansar, who were the residents of Medina. They had their houses, they had their tribes, they had their wealth. So they were now paired as brothers to help one another in order to be able to let the Muslim community take root and flourish. Some of the Muhajirin said in later times that we never imagined anybody could be as generous as the Ansar were with us. The Ansar literally sometimes said that, "O Messenger of God, we are willing to divide our houses in half. We are willing to divide our property in half. We are willing to split our resources in order to let the Muhajirin be able to flourish." And the Muhajirin admitted that probably if it had been reversed, we would not have done so as easily. And very few people would have been able to do so. That is one very supreme sacrifice that members of the Ansar, they did make. One advice that the Prophet gave to the Ansar, though, when they came to the Prophet and they said that we want to divide everything, is don't divide all of your property. The specific example is this. The Ansar, Medina was a city that had some cultivation, date palms would grow in the vicinity, and so people had land that was productive. And the Ansar had said that, Ya Rasulullah, we want to give half of our land for cultivation to our brothers from the Muhajirin. Now, the Ansar, they had generations of experience in how to grow those produce, those fruits, those dates effectively. They knew how to manage it. They had cultural traditions, not just about how to make the best use of the land, but also how to divide it among families, how to give responsibilities to different people so that it will be used productively. The Muhajirin came from Mecca. As the Quran itself says, it's not a very hospitable land for cultivation or for growing things. And they didn't have that experience and they didn't have those traditions. The Prophet said to the Ansar that don't divide your land between yourselves and the Muhajirin. Until now he had just said that share with them, treat them as your own brothers, give them what is equal to you. But now the Prophet said that don't divide those lands for cultivation. Instead, keep the lands for yourself and year by year give half of the produce or a share of the produce, the profit, to your Muhajirin brethren. Let them make use of the profit, but it is probably, and these are not my words, an explanation for the wisdom of the Prophet's advice, but it is probably better kept in your hands because you are a community that knows how to handle the capital itself, the resource itself. Share it with the Muhajirin so that they can benefit from it, and in fact the Muhajirin may have been better able to manage the capital because the Muhajirin were a trading community. So Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, for example, he was one of the Muhajirin. He says that when I came to Medina, the brother that the Prophet paired me with, his name was Sa'ad, he offered to give me half of everything. And I said to him, no, just show me where the marketplace of Medina is. And give me some guidance about how the market works and where it operates. And that is all he took from his Ansari brother. And it said that within a short time he was able to earn a small fortune, because that is what he used to do in Mecca, and he knew how to do that very well. So the point is that we see the Prophet gave advice that says that when you want to give charity in a way that is generous. Don't be stingy. Don't withhold the benefit. But give charity in a way that preserves your ability to continue to give charity in the future, and even for your generations to be able to continue to give charity in the future. Don't make a decision once, and then that's it. And you sit back and say, well, I gave it away, and that person can't manage it properly, and it's done. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let me briefly mention one other example. The battle or the campaign of Bani al-Mustaliq was a campaign in which the Muslims, they were to march against an aggressive tribe that had broken its pledges and that was preparing for an aggression against the Muslims. During that campaign, the Muslims were able to defeat the enemy, and many of the people of that tribe were taken as captives. Now, in that time, the practice was that those captives who had been taken, they were distributed among the people who had risked their lives and their property in order to engage in that campaign. Then they could decide, they could set their captives free. They could ask for the captives to bring a ransom to compensate them for the risk that they gave to their lives, the loss of their property, the loss of their time. They could say that we want a ransom, or they could decide. But it was their right to do what they wished in order to deal with the captives that had come to their portion. That was a general principle which was applied by the Muslims and by the non-Muslims, and it was part of the nature of warfare at that time. In this campaign, there was a number of such captives who came into the possession of the Muslims, and one of them was the daughter of the chief of Bani al-Mustaliq, Juwayriya bint al-Harith. When they returned to Medina and these captives were there, Juwayriya and her father, who had not been captured but came later to negotiate with the Prophet, they tried to negotiate her freedom. That either the Prophet could set her free, or that her father could ransom her and give some amount of money to the Prophet, and she would become free. The Prophet refused. On the surface, that might seem to be an ungenerous decision. But what the Prophet said in place of that is that I will propose marriage to Juwayriya. So not taking any compensation at all, instead giving a proposal, which means the Prophet is going to pay a dowry, and he is going to pay for a walima, and he is going to accept somebody into his household. Nothing being given, something being taken. Juwayriya bint al-Harith accepts the proposal, and now she enters into the household of the Prophet. And Banu al-Mustaliq was not a large tribe. Now all of those captives in Medina, they are relatives of the Prophet's wife. All of a sudden, it is embarrassing for the Muslims to have captives who are related to the Prophet. And so history says that the Muslims all set their captives free. They did not ask for ransom, they did not ask for payment, but they set their captives free in order to be able to honor the marriage of the Prophet. So this is another example that we have where the Prophet didn't give a superficial response that, yes, it is charitable, I will forgive my captive and set her free. Or I will accept payment and I will use that payment for charity. If the Prophet had done either one of those two things, one person would have gone free. One person would have benefited. But many of those people would have still been in captivity. If the Prophet had even gone to the Muslims and said that I request you to set your captives free, some of them would have probably done so. But many of them would have done so with a grudge in their heart that we could have used these resources in order to take care of our debts and take care of ourselves, and the Prophet made us do something, and so they would have had a grudge. But through this wisdom of the Prophet, they were able to achieve their freedom without any kind of grudge, without any kind of loss for the Muslims or for them. So we can think of other examples if we had time, but this is a general principle of the Prophet, that when it comes to dealing with the affairs of the Muslim community, don't just think in terms of your next step. Don't just think in terms of what superficially looks to be generous or looks to be a good course of action. What is pleasing to Allah and what is actually generous is that which lasts. Is that which has a good effect on society for the long term, not just for today and for tomorrow. And this is perhaps the one aspect of the legacy of the Prophet which is the least appreciated in practical terms by Muslims. We are very quick to make statements, to take positions, to become emotional about issues, because we think that life and death and heaven and hell all depend on how I respond to this one question. But in reality, if we want to understand the Prophet and if we want to be loyal to the Prophet, then it is not a question of today, and it is not a question of tomorrow, but it is a question of furthering the values of Islam over the long term, over a lifetime. When I am dealing with my children, then I want to make them good Muslims, not just so they pray today, but so that they become people who appreciate the value of prayer even when I am no longer with them and even when I am no longer alive. I don't want to encourage our communities just to have a good program now. I want to lay the groundwork for something which will last for a long time. And in some cases, that might mean making some sacrifices for the short term in order to lay the best groundwork for the long term. I will conclude my remarks there, although there is much more that can be said because we are out of time, but this is one of those issues which it is very important for us as Muslims to be aware of, because it is the aspect of the seerah that is perhaps the most misappreciated and misunderstood. And that is why many people do not appreciate the importance of Karbala as well. Those who do not appreciate Karbala, they view the incidents of the life of Imam Hussein just in terms of the decisions he made during his time. I've spoken about how there were other companions who had a different response to Yazid, a very military response like Abdullah ibn Zubayr. or a quietist response that just don't rock the boat and preserve the unity of the Muslim Ummah, like Abdullah ibn Umar, and other types of responses like that. If we look at Islam just in terms of the present day circumstances, those seem to be reasonable responses. That you want to have a military response because Yazid is evil. And so Abdullah ibn Zubayr seems to be making, on the surface, a reasonable decision. Abdullah ibn Umar's perspective is also reasonable. That yes, Yazid is bad, but if we divide the Muslim community, then our external enemies will also become stronger. And that seems to be, at least, an opinion worthy of consideration. But if we look at the long-term horizon, then not only do we determine that Imam Hussein was right, but that it is the only possible opinion which is worthy of respect and veneration. It's not just that it was first among equals, but the other opinions lose their luster because the horizon upon which a Muslim should operate and the horizon upon which Imam Hussein operated was to establish principles for the long-term understanding of what Islam is. Yes, did it create disunity? It did. It divided Kufa. It divided Muslims in the immediate aftermath, but it also established a principle. And if your horizon is 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, you might think that Imam Hussein divided the Muslim Ummah. Na'udhu billah. But if your horizon is the horizon of the Prophet, if your horizon is the horizon of the Imams, and if your horizon is the horizon that we as Muslims should have, then it wasn't a division. It was the only basis upon which the Muslim Ummah can understand its function and can ever hope to achieve unity. And that is why we need to commemorate the sacrifices of Imam Hussein until today. Because it is the basis for our unity, and it is the basis for us to understand the comprehensiveness of the legacy of the Prophet. Pray to Allah that He allows us to extend our horizon, and we pray to Allah that He allows us to appreciate the depth of the seerah of the Prophet and not just its superficial aspect, which has been a mistake that so many people have fallen into. Today, as you know, is the eve of the 13th of Muharram, and it is actually not just a day that came after Karbala, but a day, according to many ahadith, which has a particular tragedy associated with it. By the 13th of Muharram, the captives have left Karbala. They are now in Kufa. But the enemy made sure to take care of its dead before they left Karbala. On the 10th, and on the 11th, and on the 12th of Muharram, there were some bodies lying on the sands of Karbala, unburied, unshrouded, and unrecognized. It wasn't the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, it was the bodies of the martyrs of Karbala, which were lying without any kind of final rights and respects being paid to them. Bani Asad was one tribe that lived in the vicinity of Karbala, and ahadith tell us that the men of Bani Asad wanted to come to the battlefield, and they wanted to bury the bodies of the shuhada, but they were afraid. They said that, what if Yazid still has spies, or what if Ibn Ziyad still has soldiers in the vicinity? And so they held back until their wives and their women folk said that this is an embarrassment. You were not there to help the grandson of the Prophet, so now that the battle has taken place, at the very least, go and bury the bodies. And so out of embarrassment, perhaps, some men from Bani Asad, that tribe, they came to Karbala, and they said that we are here now to bury the bodies of the companions and the followers and the Imam himself. But what did they see when they came to Karbala? They saw that the bodies are not recognizable. There are limbs strewn and different parts of the battlefield. There are bodies without a head. And they said that if we cannot recognize the bodies, then how can we give a final or a proper burial and give our final respects to them? And so they stood there in confusion until in the distance they saw that there was a solitary person coming on a horse. And when that person came close, He had tears in his eyes, and he was speaking in a low voice, and Bani Asad did not recognize him. And he asked them, "What are you doing here?" And they said that we have come to bury the body of the grandson of the Prophet and those who were with him. But when we came, we saw that we are not up to this task. We don't know how to do it. And he said that, "Let me give you guidance." And it is said that that man, who they still did not recognize, dismounted from the horse. And then he recounted to them what had taken place on the day of Ashura. And he began to tell them that this part of the battlefield is where so-and-so fell. And here are the pieces of his body, collect them together, and this is one body. And then he went to another body, and he informed them of the identity of that martyr as well, until he came to one body that had been injured more than any other, that had been wounded more than any other, that had been trampled more severely than any other. And here the Imam did not use words, but it is said that he threw himself upon that body, and he wept for a long time, and he said, "Father, what have they done to you? Upon your martyrdom, even your body was treated with such harshness and such cruelty." And then after a long time of weeping, the Imam said that this is the body of the grandson of the Prophet of God. He showed them how to bury, and then he buried Ali Akbar and the other family members of the Prophet next to the body of Imam Hussein, and the other martyrs were buried all together. And then the Imam began to walk towards Alqama, the river, which is a tributary of Furat. Perhaps some of the members of Bani Asad said that, "Where is the Imam going? We have already seen the battlefield, and we have already buried the bodies." But the Imam went on that journey, and as he walked, he bent down and he picked up one arm. And then he went some further distance and he picked up another arm. And he reached not far from the banks of the Euphrates tributary. And then he found a body there, and he told them, "This is the body of Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas." And then he also had that body buried. When all of this was done, and the bodies had been buried, and Bani Asad had been told where the battle took place, and where the bodies were to be buried, and who the bodies belonged to, for them to pass on that knowledge to future generations, the Imam turned to the battlefield, and he bid his final salam, and he began to leave. And they grabbed onto his cloak, and they said, "Tell us, who are you?" And they said that, "You don't know who I am? I was just here with you a few days ago. You didn't hear when my father called out for help, and there was no one to answer his call? There was no one to answer his plea to have people come to the assistance of the progeny of the Prophet? I am the heir of the Imam whom you buried. And because there was no one who answered the call of the Imam, I must now return to the captivity, where even now the granddaughters of the Prophet and the grandchildren of the Prophet, they are in a dungeon of Kufa." And the Imam returned to Kufa to continue on the journey that would take them to the castle of Yazid and to the dungeons of Sham before they were able to eventually reach Medina. May Allah have mercy upon the martyrs of Karbala and their lovers and their followers, and may He keep us always on their path in this life and in the hereafter. Let us recite for the sponsors of tonight's majlis who would like to remain anonymous, and for all of our marhumin, and for all believers, wherever they may be throughout the world, for their family members, for shuhada, a Surah Fatiha preceded by Salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.